the badger came up out of the ground with its teeth already showing. Cole Hargrave held still. 20 years of horses had taught him what to do with an animal that had decided to die instead of move, and this one had decided. It planted itself in the dry wash between him and the woman lying in the shade of the cut bank, and it made a sound he had never heard come out of anything that size. The woman did not move. Her lips had split open. The skin across her knuckles was burned white. He knew her face. Everybody in Coyote Wells knew her face. In 11 days, she was going to marry the man who had spent 6 years telling the Arizona Territory that Cole Hargrave was a murderer. He crouched down slow. He put his hand out flat, palm up, and the badger's growl climbed. And Cole Hargrave understood that whatever he did in the next minute was going to be the worst decision of his life. The only question was which one. 2 days earlier, the whole of Coyote Wells came out to watch the water. Nathaniel Crane had built the pump house at the north end of the square, out of quarried stone with a copper weather vane on it that cost more than most of the houses looking at it. At noon on Monday, he stood on the step in a gray coat with the dust brushed off it, and he pulled the lever himself. And the water came up out of the pipe and fell into the stone trough, and 80 people made a sound like they were watching a child take its first step. He did not make a speech about himself. That was the thing about Crane. He never did. He talked about the valley. He said a town without water was a town with a date on it, and Coyote Wells was not going to have a date on it. He said the railroad had made an offer, and he had told the railroad it could wait until every family in the valley had a say. He said it low, without heat, the way a man says a thing he assumes everyone already agrees with, and Reverend Boyle put his hand on Crane's shoulder, and the schoolteacher's children clapped. Adeline Whitlock stood at the edge of the crowd and watched her fiancé accept the gratitude of 100 people. And she thought about Serafina Avila. Nobody said the name anymore. 6 years ago, the Avila family had run cattle on the best water in the county, and then their house had burned with them inside it, and the county had buried what was left. Only the widow survived, because she had been in town that night buying thread. Adeline had been 19. She remembered the widow sitting on the church steps for 3 days. Then the widow had signed a paper and gone away to Sonora, and the water had gone to Crane, and by the following spring there was nothing to say about it at all. Adeline had believed that story the way you believe the weather. It had taken her 2 months of quiet arithmetic to stop believing it. It started with a receipt. Crane kept his accounts in a locked walnut secretary in the front office, and in April he had asked her to copy out a list of feed prices for him because her hand was better than his, and he had left her alone in the room for an hour with the key in the drawer. She had copied the feed prices. She had also seen, on the underside of a folded receipt, a number that did not belong to any transaction she had ever heard him mention. After that she went back, not often. Once a week, twice at most, always with a reason ready. And in 8 weeks she had built a shape in her head that she could not knock down. That night she went back one last time. The house was quiet. Crane had ridden out to the north pasture and would not be home before 10. She lit one lamp, turned it down to a bead, opened the secretary and took out the long ledger with the green cloth spine. She already knew what was in it. She had read the pages in pieces over weeks, the way you eat something you are afraid of. But knowing a thing and holding it are different, and when she laid the book flat and put her finger on the first entry, her hand was not steady. March 14, 1878. Avila Parcel, Section 9, conveyed N. Crane, 6 weeks before the fire. 6 weeks before the family that owned it died in it. She turned forward. There was a page of small disbursements, feed and nails and wages, and in the middle of it, in Crane's own careful hand, 2 payments of $40 each, 3 days before the fire. One to a man named Reese Coyne, the other to T. Whitlock. Adeline sat down on the floor of her fiancé's office with the ledger in her lap. Toby had been 17 that spring. He had a bad shoulder and a laugh you could hear from the end of the street, and he rode for Crane because Crane paid better than anybody, and 2 years later he was dead in a stock corral outside Dry Fork, shot through the chest by Cole Hargrave. She had carried her aunt out of the church that day. She had held the woman up under both arms while she screamed at the ceiling. Adeline turned one more page. The last thing in the book was a draft agreement, unsigned, dated for the coming Sunday. The conveyance of all water rights on the Coyote Wells Basin to the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad Company, in perpetuity for a figure that made her stomach turn. With Nathaniel Crane named as sole grantor, 60 families in the valley, every one of them drinking out of his hand for the next 20 years. She could not take the book. He looked at that secretary every day of his life. So she took a penknife and she cut 3 pages out of it along the gutter close, so the stubs would sit down flat, and she closed the ledger and put it back exactly as she had found it and turned the key. Upstairs, she folded the pages twice. She unpicked 8 inches of the hem of her dark blue traveling dress, laid them flat inside the fold of the fabric, and sewed it shut again with small stitches, and then she sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for a long time with her hands in her lap. She did not know yet that a man in Coyote Wells had already noticed the scratches around the keyhole. He came to her at breakfast, and he was kind. He said her father had written from Camp Verde, and that the old man sounded low, and that a bride ought to see her father before a wedding. He said he had already told Mrs. Boyle she would be away 4 days. He said he would drive her out to the stage road himself. Adeline said that would be lovely. Later she would take that morning apart 100 times and find nothing in it. He ate his eggs. He complimented the coffee. He asked whether she wanted the black hat or the straw and said the straw for the sun. They left at 9 in the buggy with the good mare and the traces. And for the first hour he talked about fence line and about the Reverend's cough, and the country opened out flat and pale on both sides of them, greasewood and rock, and the blue shoulder of the mountains a long way off. Then he said, without any change in his voice at all, "You've been in my books, Adeline." She said nothing. That was the mistake. A woman with nothing to hide asks what on earth he means. 2 months, Crane said. I'd have thought less of you if you hadn't. You're not a stupid girl. He clicked his tongue at the mare. How much did you read? And here is the thing she never forgave herself for, she told him. Not out of fear. Out of a kind of terrible relief. Because she had been alone with it for 8 weeks, and because some piece of her still believed the man beside her was going to explain it. She said she had read about Section 9. She said she had read the March date. She said his name, Toby's name, and she heard her voice break on it, and she said, "Tell me it isn't what it looks like." Crane pulled the mare up. For a moment he looked genuinely sorry. That was the worst part. He looked at her the way a man looks at a horse with a broken leg, with real regret and no doubt at all about what happens next. "Get down," he said. She did not understand. She said his name. "Get down, Adeline." He did not touch her. He never touched her. He waited while she climbed out into the road with the sun already white overhead, and then he reached back and took her carpet bag and set it in the dirt beside her. And he said the only cruel thing he said all day. "There's water at Camp Verde. It's 30 miles. You've always been a great walker." She stood in the road with her hand up against the light and watched the buggy turn. He drove east until he was out of her sight. Then he stopped and got down and took from his coat a battered tin tobacco box with the letters CH scratched into the lid. A thing he had bought off a drunk for $2 in November, and he dropped it in the dust at the edge of the road and pressed it half under with his boot. A quarter-mile on, his man Reese Coyne was waiting with a shod horse and instructions, and he crossed the road twice, north to south, in no hurry at all. By 4 o'clock, Crane was back in Coyote Wells, with his hat in his hands and his voice gone rough, telling Sheriff Amos Pike that his buggy had been stopped on the Camp Verde road by a man on a bay horse, and that he had been dragged down, and that when he got up his fiancée was gone. He did not say the name. He was too careful for that. He let the town say it for him. Adeline walked until 3 in the afternoon. She was a sensible woman, and she did the sensible things. She followed the road. She kept her hat on. She did not drink the last of the water in her flask until she could no longer feel her tongue at the back of her mouth. At 3 the road bent north away from the mountains, and she understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, that she had been walking the wrong way for 2 hours. She sat down on a rock. She got up again. Somewhere after that the country stopped making sense to her, and she left the road, because there was a line of green in the middle distance that she believed was cottonwood, and was in fact nothing but a shadow on the rock. She fell twice. The second time she did not get up for a while. What saved her was a dry wash about 9 feet deep, cut into the flat like a knife slot, with a cut bank on the west side that threw 4 feet of shade. She came to the edge of it at sundown and half fell, half slid down into it, and the shade came over her like water, and she lay against the sand with her cheek on her arm and did not move for a long time. The badger's den was 11 feet away. It came out at dusk, because that is when they come out. It was low and wide, and its coat was the color of the ground, with one white stripe running from its nose over its skull and down its back, and it moved with its belly almost against the sand. It saw her. It stopped. Then it made the sound. Adeline had never heard anything like it. It was not a dog, and it was not a cat. It was a low, rolling machinery noise, and the animal came 3 steps toward her with its whole body flattened and its claws. She would remember the claws, turned out like garden tools. She did not have the strength to run. She lifted one hand and said, in a voice with nothing left in it, "I'm not going to touch your house." The badger stopped 4 feet away. It stayed there, grumbling, watching her, and after a while it went back and dug at its mound and threw sand out behind it, and it came back and looked at her again, and this went on until the light was gone. It never came near her. It never left, either. That was the first night. The second day was worse than anything she had a word for. By 10 the shade was gone, and by noon the sand under her was hot enough to burn through cloth, and she moved along the cut bank a foot at a time, chasing 4 inches of shadow. She stopped being thirsty around 1 o'clock, which she understood, distantly, was a very bad sign. Her tongue had swollen. She could feel the stitches of the hem against her ankle, and she held on to that, the small hard line of the folded paper, because it was the only thing in the world that still meant anything. At 2 in the afternoon the vultures came. There were 5 of them, and they did not come for her. They came down onto the mound at the mouth of the den, where the badger had dragged the carcass of a jackrabbit the night before, and the badger came out of the ground like an explosion. Adeline turned her head and watched a 30-pound animal fight 5 birds with 6-foot wingspans over a bone in a hole in the desert and lose and go back down and come out again. 2 miles east, on the high ground above the flat, a man reined in his horse. Cole Hargrave had been up on the rim since morning looking for a 2-year-old colt that had gone through a fence, and he had seen a great many things that day that meant nothing. But 5 vultures working the ground and lifting and settling and lifting again in one spot for 20 minutes without ever committing. Something down there was still fighting them. He sat his horse a long while. It was 3 miles out of his way in the wrong part of the afternoon, and Cole Hargrave had made a life out of not going 3 miles out of his way for anybody. Then he turned the bay down off the rim. He smelled the wash before he saw it. He came along the lip on foot, leading the horse, and he looked down into the shade and saw a woman lying in a dark blue dress with a straw hat 2 yards from her hand. He was down the bank in 4 steps, and the badger came out of the ground with its teeth already showing. It put itself between him and her. It was half dead itself, and it had been fighting birds all afternoon over a rabbit bone, and it stood in that slot of sand and told him, in the only language it had, that this was as far as he went. Cole crouched. He put his hand out flat. "All right," he said. "All right, it's your house." He backed up 3 steps. He took his canteen off the saddle, and he poured a good third of it into the crown of his hat, and he set the hat down in the sand at the edge of the mound and backed away again. Then he went around the long way, down the wash and up the other side, and knelt by the woman, and turned her face out of the sand, and recognized her Adeline Whitlock. Nathaniel Crane's bride. Her eyes came open. Not all the way. Enough. She knew him. Every soul in that county knew that face. The long jaw, the scar down the left forearm where he had gone through a corral rail after a steer, the flat way he looked at a person. Cole Hargrave, the devil of Dry Fork, the man who had put a bullet in her cousin Toby. Her hand came up out of the sand with a 2-inch sewing knife in it, and she went for his throat. She had nothing left. He caught her wrist without any trouble at all and held it, and looked at the little bone-handled blade, and looked at her. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm the worst piece of luck you ever had. But I'm the only piece you've got." Then he took the knife out of her fingers, and put his canteen against her mouth, and let her have 3 swallows and no more, before you find out what that decision cost him. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And if you like westerns where the quiet man turns out to be the honest one, stay with me. It gets worse before it gets better. By Thursday evening, Coyote Wells had a story, and the story had 18 men in it. Sheriff Amos Pike stood on the step of his own office and told them to go home. He told them the territory had marshals for this. He told them that a posse without a warrant was just a crowd with rifles, and about half of them looked at their boots and none of them left. Nathaniel Crane came out of the crowd and put his hand on Pike's arm. "Amos," he said, gently, in front of everybody. "I know what you're saying. I do." He turned around to the street. "And I'll say this in front of the Reverend. If Hargrave brings her back to this town by Sunday unharmed, I will not press one charge. Not one. I want my girl home. That's all I want." It was a beautiful thing to watch. Adeline had spent 2 years watching him do it and had never once seen the wire under it, because by Thursday morning Crane had opened the walnut secretary and had run his thumb down the gutter of a green-spined ledger and had felt 3 stubs where 3 pages ought to be. He had stood in that office for a full minute without moving. Then he had gone out and been kind to everybody. He did not want his girl home. He wanted 8 inches of hem, and he wanted it before noon on Sunday, when a marshal named Ezra Bly would come down from Prescott to witness the signing of a water contract in the square, and he had just arranged, in public, with the Reverend as his witness, for 18 armed men to go find it for him. Reese Coyne rode north with 6 of them, toward the Camp Verde road. He knew exactly where to look, and he made sure a man named Dolfieri found the tobacco tin, so it would not be him that found it. By dark the whole county knew that Cole Hargrave had dragged Nathaniel Crane out of his own buggy on the Camp Verde road and taken his bride. Nobody in Coyote Wells found that hard to believe. That was the part that would sit in Cole's chest for the rest of his life. Not that Crane had lied, that the lie had not needed any help. He got her out of the wash on his own horse and walked beside it. He did not take her back to town. She was too far gone for 30 miles, and past that, he had worked it out somewhere on the bank of that wash in about 4 seconds, the way you work out a river crossing. A man with his name did not ride into Coyote Wells, with Nathaniel Crane's fiancée slung across his saddle and come back out again. So he went northwest, toward Dolores Mere Station on the old freight road, which was 11 miles, and he walked every one of them because the bay could carry her, or it could carry them both, and not well. She came back to herself around midnight, in a plank room that smelled of coffee and lamp oil, with her boots off and a wet cloth on her forehead and a small brown woman putting salve on her hands. "Don't sit up," Dolores said. "You'll be sick." Adeline sat up and was sick. Afterward she lay back and looked at the ceiling and said, Where is he? Outside with the horses. He won't come in while you're on that bed. Dolores wrung the cloth out. He's been out there 4 hours. Do you know who he is? I've known him 12 years. He killed my cousin. Dolores Muir folded the cloth and set it on the rail, and she said, yes. And your fiancé left you on the Camp Verde road with 1 flask of water. Both those things are true, and only one of them is going to matter to you by Sunday. Drink this. They left before dawn, because at 4 in the morning a rider came through going the other way and said there were men on the freight road asking after a bay horse. Dolores gave them her own gray mare and a canteen, and 6 days of hardtack she could not spare. Adeline said, they'll ask you, they'll ask me. Dolores agreed. What will you say? The old woman looked at Cole for a moment, and something went across her face that Adeline did not understand until much later. I'll say the same thing I said 6 years ago, she said, and this time I hope somebody believes me. They rode out on the 2 horses with the sun not up, and Adeline Whitlock did not say one word to Cole Hargrave for the first 9 miles. Then, on a rise above the salt flat, she pulled up and said it. March of 79. A stock corral outside Dry Fork. Say it out loud. Cole sat his horse and looked at the country ahead of them and did not pretend to misunderstand. He drew first, he said. He was 19. He was 19 and he drew first. Cole's voice did not go up at all. That's not a defense, ma'am. That's just the order it happened in. Why were you there? Because I'd spent 2 months looking for the men that set the Avila fire, and 2 of them were in that corral. She said, that's a lie. All right, that's a lie. Because Toby was 17 years old that spring and he mucked stalls. And if you're going to sit there and tell me a boy of 17 burned a family alive. I never said he said it, Cole said. I said he was in the corral, and there it was. The thing she would take apart later, in the firelight, when she finally read her own page, she kicked the gray forward and did not look at him for another 6 miles. They made 40 miles that day, which was more than the horses had in them, along the salt flat with the mountains going purple on their left. Twice they saw dust to the south. Once, in the late afternoon, Cole took them a mile out of the line to a stone tank in a rock cleft that no map had ever had on it, and he filled the canteens and let the horses have exactly as much as was good for them and not a swallow more, and Adeline watched him do it. He drank last. She noticed that. She did not want to notice it. That night they camped without a fire under a shelf of rock, and she lay awake with the folded pages against her ankle, and she said into the dark, why are you doing this? There was a long silence. She thought he had gone to sleep. 6 years ago, Cole said, I got to the Avila place about 40 minutes late. I could see it from the rim. I want you to understand that I sat on a horse and watched a house burn, and I got there 40 minutes late. And after that, I did some things about it, and none of them helped anybody. She heard him turn over. You were lying in a hole in the ground, and I was 2 miles off on high ground, looking down. He said nothing else for a while. I wasn't going to be late twice, he said. The storm caught them Saturday noon on open ground. It came up out of the south as a brown wall 40 feet high, and it took the daylight out of the world in about 90 seconds. Cole got them down into a shallow blowout and put both horses on their sides and made her lie against the gray's back with her face in the crook of her arm. And he lay across the open side of her, with his coat spread, and held it. And the sand came over the top of them for 25 minutes, like water out of a broken dam. When it passed, the country was scoured clean and their tracks were gone. So were Reese Coyne's, but Coyne had a compass and 11 men and fresh horses out of Coyote Wells. And Cole had one thing Coyne did not have, which was 14 years of running cattle across that particular flat. He turned them due west, onto ground he had been avoiding for 2 days. Adeline saw why within a mile. The whole flat was undermined. Prairie dog towns going back a generation, and the long slanted burrows of badgers that had come in after them, mound after mound after mound, some of them collapsed into pits a horse could put a leg into the shoulder. Get down, Cole said. We walk from here, every step you look. It took them 4 hours to cross 6 miles. Reese Coyne came onto the same ground at 5 in the afternoon at a trot, and the first horse went down at the near edge, and the man was thrown clear and got up swearing with his wrist bent wrong, and the horse got up too and stood there shaking with its head low. Coyne sat in the saddle and looked west across 6 miles of it. Then he swung down and told 11 men to get off their horses and lead them. It cost him 3 hours. It cost him the light, and on the far side of that flat, in the mouth of a rock draw where the ground was hard again, Adeline Whitlock sat down by a fire the size of a hat and finally opened her hem. She had not touched the pages since Wednesday night. She had not needed to. She knew what was on them. But Cole had said a name at the water tank that afternoon. Coyne, he's the one running them. He's got a compass and no sense. And something in her had turned over. She unpicked the stitches with her teeth and took out 3 pieces of paper, soft and furred at the folds, and she held the second one to the firelight. July 9, 1878. R. Coyne, $40. July 9, 1878. T. Whitlock, $40. She read it 4 times. Reese Coyne, she said. Cole looked up from the horses. He's the second man, she said. He's the man in the corral, the one who got away from you. Cole came over and crouched down and read it upside down, and she watched his face do something she had not seen it do, go completely still, the way a man's face goes when a thing he has carried for 6 years turns out to weigh exactly what he said it did. $40, he said, 3 days before. He was 17, her voice was not working properly. He held horses. That's all he'd have done. He'd have held the horses. He wouldn't have known what for. No, Cole said. He probably wouldn't have. Don't you dare be kind to me. I'm not being kind. I'm telling you what I think is true. He sat back on his heels. I think Crane paid a boy $40 to hold horses in the dark and never told him why. I think 2 years later that boy had figured out what he'd held them for, and I think that's exactly why he was in a corral outside Dry Fork with Reese Coyne at night when a man came looking. Adeline put her hands over her face. And I think, Cole said, that when I came through that gate he was 19 years old and frightened out of his life, and he drew on me, and I killed him, and none of what I just said makes that anything other than what it is. She cried then. Not gently. She cried the way you cry when you have been holding a wall up with your back for 2 months and somebody finally tells you the wall was always going to fall. He did not touch her. He put another stick on the fire and he sat there with her until she was done. They came into the Cañada del Oro at first light on Sunday with 19 miles to go and 4 hours to do it in. The draw narrowed to a slot 40 feet wide with a dry watercourse down the middle of it, and it was the only way through the ridge that a horse could take. Cole knew it. He also knew that Reese Coyne knew it, because Coyne had run cattle in that country too, and because a man with a compass and 11 riders does not need to track you if he can get in front of you. They were 400 yards into the slot when the first shot came off the east wall. It hit the rock beside the gray's head, and the gray went up and Adeline came off her, hard, onto her shoulder in the gravel. The second shot was already coming. Cole was out of the saddle before she had her breath back, and he had her by the collar and the belt, and he put her behind a shelf of fallen sandstone, the size of a wagon, and the third shot took him through the left side, low, going in and out clean. He sat down against the rock with a grunt like a man setting down something heavy. Above them, Reese Coyne's voice came off the walls, doubled and flattened. "Miss Whitlock, you come on out and there's nobody hurt." Adeline had her hands inside Cole's shirt. There was a hole in front and a hole behind and more blood than she had ever seen outside of a slaughter pen. And she pulled the tail out of his shirt and wadded it and pressed, and he made a sound through his teeth. "Listen to me," he said. "Be quiet. There's a chimney behind you. 40 feet. It comes out on the west rim. The gray'll go up it if you lead her. She's a mountain horse." He got hold of her wrist. His hand was very cold. "Coyote Wells is 9 miles from the top. You'll be there by 10. I said, be quiet. They're not shooting at you." His eyes were going glassy at the edges, and he hung on to her wrist anyway. "They can't shoot at you. That's the whole trouble with his story. He needs you dead in a place where I did it. So while I'm alive down here, you can walk right up that rim and no man of his will put a hand on you, because 11 of those boys still think they're here to rescue you." Adeline understood then what he was telling her. He was telling her he was the reason the road was open. He was telling her to go and to leave him sitting against that rock with 2 holes in him and Reese Coyne coming down the wall. Because if she rode into Coyote Wells at 10 o'clock with 3 pages in her hand, 60 families kept their water. And the man who had put a bullet through her cousin got what was, by any arithmetic the territory would recognize, his due. She could have all of it. She only had to trade him for it. She looked at his hand around her wrist. She looked at his face. And Adeline Whitlock, who had spent 6 years being told what this man was by a man who had left her in the road to die, made the only decision in the whole business that nobody had planned for her. She took his hand off her wrist. She put it flat on the wadded shirt and closed his fingers on it. "Press," she said. "Hard as you can, Adeline. You listen." She was already tearing at her skirt. "I am not going to stand in that square on Sunday holding a piece of paper about a burned family and tell those people that I let a man bleed to death in a canyon because it was faster. That is his arithmetic. I've been engaged to his arithmetic for 2 years." She got the strip free and started it around him. "We're both going, or we're both stopping here. Lift your arm." He lifted his arm. It took her 9 minutes to get him bound and 11 more to get him on the gray, and Reese Coyne's men came down the east wall at the far end of the slot the whole time, and it should not have worked at all. What made it work was Dolph Yeri. Yeri was 31, a fence rider, and he had come out because a woman had been taken. He got down into the slot 200 yards ahead of the others, and he came around the sandstone shelf with his rifle up and found Nathaniel Crane's fiancée on her knees in the gravel holding a tourniquet on a shotman, and she looked up at him and said one sentence. "He's been carrying me for 3 days. Where were you?" Dolph Yeri stood there with his rifle half down. Then he turned around and shouted up the canyon that there was nothing in the draw but rock, and he stood in the middle of the watercourse and let them come to him, and it cost Reese Coyne another 20 minutes. Halfway up the chimney, with Cole Hargrave's weight across her shoulders and the gray scrambling on the shale above her, Adeline stopped for breath and found his face 2 inches from hers, gray as ash and looking at her. She kissed him. Once, hard, with blood on both of them. "That's not a promise," she said. "That's just so you keep climbing." He kept climbing. They had a table out in the square, under an awning, with a white cloth on it. Nathaniel Crane had thought of everything. He had thought of the awning and the cloth and the pitcher of water from his own pump, sweating in the heat where everyone could see it. He had the Reverend on his right and the railroad man from Albuquerque on his left, and standing a little apart, in a dusty black coat with a star he had not bothered to polish, United States Marshal Ezra Bly of the Territory of Arizona, present as witness, 200 people. Every family in the valley. Crane was speaking about his fiancée. He was saying that he would sign this contract today because 60 families should not have to wait on one man's grief, and that when Adeline came home, when, he said, and let it sit, she would want to find the valley safe. It was, by common agreement afterward, the finest thing anybody in Coyote Wells had ever heard. Then the gray mare came up the length of Front Street with 2 people on her. Cole Hargrave was not conscious, exactly. He was upright, which was as much as could be said, tied at the wrists to the horn with a strip of blue traveling dress, and Adeline Whitlock was walking at the mare's head in what was left of the skirt, barefoot, her face burned raw, leading a horse into a square of 200 people who had spent 4 days being told she was a captive. Nobody said anything at all. Sheriff Amos Pike came off the boardwalk with his gun out because that was his job and everybody was watching him do it, and he got about 6 feet. "Amos," Adeline said, "put that away and get him down. He's been shot." Crane was already moving. He came around the table with his hands out and his face open with relief. Genuine relief, and this is important, because for 1 full second Nathaniel Crane's relief was the realest thing in the square. She was here. That meant the pages were here. "Adeline," he said. "Oh, thank God, thank God. Marshal Bly," Adeline said past him to the man in the black coat, "do not let anyone touch this horse." Bly had not moved since Front Street. He said, "Ma'am, why don't you tell me what I'm looking at?" So she told him. She stood in the square with her hand on the gray's neck, and she told 200 people that her fiancé had driven her out on the Camp Verde Road on Wednesday morning and set her down in the dirt 30 miles from water and driven away, and that Cole Hargrave had found her Thursday afternoon in a wash with a badger's den in it and had walked her out. The square made a sound. Not a nice one. Crane did not raise his voice. He never had to. "She's been 4 days in the sun," he said, and he said it to Bly gently, like a man asking for mercy on behalf of someone else. "Marshal, look at her. Look at what's been done to her, whatever that man has told her." "Then look at these," Adeline said, and put 3 pages on the white cloth. She had carried them 4 days. They were soft as cloth themselves. Bly read them standing up. He read the March conveyance of Section 9 dated 6 weeks before a house burned with a family in it. He read $40 to R. Coyne and $40 to T. Whitlock, dated 3 days before the same fire. And he read a draft agreement conveying the entire water basin of the valley, in perpetuity, to the railroad, which was at that moment lying under his own right hand on the same table, waiting for a signature. "These are cut out of a book," Bly said. "Out of the green ledger in his front office," Adeline said. "The stubs are still in it. That ledger burned," Crane said, "in June." And the Reverend turned his head and looked at him. It was the only mistake Nathaniel Crane made in 6 years, and it took him 3 words. He knew it before he finished it. You could see it. And because he was very good, he did not stop and he did not stammer. He simply changed direction, smooth as water, and said that the pages were a forgery. That Hargrave had killed the Whitlock boy and had spent 6 years wanting to hang the blame on a better man, that the town had known what Hargrave was since before any of this. "I've got the widow's statement," Amos Pike said. He said it quietly. He had to say it twice. The second time, he said it loud enough that the back of the square heard it, and he opened his coat and took out a flat tobacco lid tin that had been under the floor of his own kitchen for 6 years, and he set it on the white cloth beside the pages. "Serafina Avila," Pike said, "June of '78. She sat in my office and I wrote it down and she put her mark on it. She swore she never signed a conveyance in her life, and that Crane's men came to that place twice in the spring, and that the second time they came at night. His hands were not steady. I never filed it. She was on a coach to Sonora inside of a week, and I told myself she'd been paid to go, and that a woman who takes money don't want it opened up again." He looked at the crowd, 200 people he had sworn to. "That's a lie I told myself for 6 years so I wouldn't have to be the man who did this today," Amos Pike said. "I want that on the record, Marshal. I'm not a witness. I'm part of it." He unpinned his star and laid it on the table. Bly let it sit there a moment. Then he said, without any particular kindness, "You'll answer for it. Sit down over there." Reese Coyne was on the edge of the crowd with his wrists strapped, and he had been backing toward the alley for a while, and when Bly's deputy took hold of his good arm, he stopped being a hard man very fast. He talked for 2 hours that afternoon, and he named everything and everybody, because the one thing men like Coyne have never once done in the entire history of the Arizona Territory is hang alone. They arrested Nathaniel Crane in front of the pump house he had built, under the copper weather vane, with the whole valley standing there. He did not shout. He turned to Adeline as they walked him past her, and he looked at her with something almost like respect, and he said, "You were never a stupid girl." "No," she said. "I was just a polite one." The railroad man from Albuquerque folded his contract, put it in his case, and went back to his hotel. The Avila water went back to Serafina Avila's sister's children by a decision of the territorial court, and the valley wrote its own agreement with the railroad the following spring. 61 signatures on it and no man's name at the top. Amos Pike served 11 months and came back and ran the livery. Some people spoke to him. Some never did again. He said once that both were fair. Dolph Yeary was the first man in Coyote Wells to shake Cole Hargrave's hand in public. It took 11 other men about 4 seconds to decide they had been meaning to do that too. Cole never got the full use of his left side back. He rode short days after that, and he rode them slow, and in the June of the following year he was crossing the North Flat, with his wife 2 lengths behind him when he pulled up. There was a fresh mound in the ground ahead of them, sand thrown out behind it in a fan, and around the mouth of it, in the crust, the long, dragging 4-clawed marks of something that had been working all night. Adeline came up beside him. They sat there a minute. It was 100 miles from a certain dry wash, and it was almost certainly nothing, and neither of them said a word about that. Then Cole turned his horse a wide half-circle around it, and she followed him, and they went on home. If this story was worth your time, do me one favor. Hit that like button and subscribe if you're new here. That's the whole thing that keeps these stories coming. And tell me in the comments, would you have left him in that canyon? I'll see you in the next one.